I guess call myself an agile coach. So I come to the lean change world through the agile side of things, and realizing that it's ultimately all about change, and people are more or less ready for what they're asking for, and a lot of it is navigating what people want, what they're ready for, and managing expectations a lot of the time, because often what they ask for is not what they need or not what they think they need, and also a lot of the challenges are not foreseen. So it's ultimately all about change in what I've experienced before my work as an agile coach, and that's what brings me to the lean change world, and I've learned a lot from that, which has been very helpful as an agile coach. So I thought I would so I've been a lean change management facilitator for 2 years, so not for a very long time. I thought I'd bring a little bit about my experience in alignment and to align teams and organizations. And I think someone isn't on mute. I don't know if it's possible to mute them. So I don't know if you're getting a scratching sound as well.
Done that.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Okay. So this is one of the questions we ask in the new course is what comes first, culture or structure? So maybe either mute yourself and let us know what your thoughts are, or type in the chat. What comes first, or where would you start? Do you address the culture first? Do you address the structure first? Both at the same time? Any thoughts or any votes in the chat? What would you say comes first? Jared thinks culture first. There's obviously no wrong or right, so don't be afraid. Culture follows structure, okay, so, and by structure you mean organizational structure. Okay, that's a really good point, yeah, Estefania. So yes and no, and we'll explore that a little bit. What is a structure? But yeah, we'll get there. So what do the rest of you think? We've got about a 50-50 balance so far. So I'll give you my take on it. Okay. So we could think of structure, or let's start with culture, as if you're thinking of like molecules. So if you take water, you can either have those molecules quite condensed and dense, or looser. And in order to change the properties of those molecules, we need to do something. And that, for example, could be changing the temperature. So we change some kind of structure, we do some kind of intervention, which has an impact on the culture. So we could take an example of putting salt on the sidewalk when it's icy. So we're changing the kind of binding properties of the water to have some result. So now we can walk without slipping, for example. So we could say that in an organizational context, how we could change the properties of a culture, if we take water, for example, we would say, let's shout at the water and hope that the water changes from an ice property to a looser property. Or we could hold hands and sing Kumbaya and hope that that does some kind of a change. Or we could change other structural elements. And what could those potentially be? So if we have a very rigid structure or culture, back to Estefania's point, sometimes it feels like we're actually talking about the same thing. So we could say that we have a hierarchical structure And if it's very fixed and if it's very rigid, like a block of ice, then we could argue that the only way that we get things done is by resorting to breaking the rules, being kind of underhanded with things in order to actually get anything done, because the structure is so rigid and the culture is so rigid. So what can we do to make it kind of looser so that there is space to move within the structure and the culture without having to overly resort to breaking rules or finding ways to get things done. So one structure we could say is a circle. So a circle is clearly a structure. And what is characteristic about that structure? I mean, what do you notice? Anyone notice anything particular about a circular structure? These people here, what do they seem to be doing? Where are they looking? Who's leading? Any thoughts?
Kind of like a flat structure. So
flat, yeah.
Yeah.
So in a circle, there's no beginning, there's no end, there's no kind of higher or lower. Everyone's at the same level. Yeah. They've also got more easy sight of each other in an equal enough way. Yeah. So that's one kind of example of a structure. An open space. Is everyone familiar with open space technology? So basically, you've got this is a open space that we ran. So basically, you've got session numbers here and like locations there, and then topics are brought up there. So whatever is current and relevant for anyone in that space at that time has a place, and then it's just a case of what's most relevant to you and which session do you want to join or not join. So you could say it's another word for it is an unconference. So again, it's kind of breaking structure. A conference, you could say, is a hierarchical structure. The speaker is the sage on the stage, is the one who has the knowledge, who's giving the information, and the rest are receiving it. In an unconference, everyone has a possibility to lead a session or to facilitate a session. That could be a presentation, it could just be a workshop. And the hive mind is able to decide and to vote on what is most relevant to them in that moment. Fishbowl conversation is also clearly a structure, as you can see. So this is a way of also getting everyone's voice potentially into the conversation around a theme, and anyone can tap anyone out at any stage. And that's not seen as like a competitive move, but more that there is a movement in me to contribute something, and I'm just going with my instincts about who to replace in that moment, because it feels to me like that person's train of conversation has run its course, and so it's time for me to replace that to continue the conversation for the benefit of myself and the group as a whole. So these are all structures that can bring about a loosening of the structure and culture. So Lean Coffee, so this is the new Lean Coffee app by Lean Change Management. As you can see, I've not really used it, but I've put my own topic in there, how to change the world. Nobody's voted on it yet, but the idea being that things can move across from groups adding topics to then voting on them, then starting the conversation, and then perhaps timing it for a certain length of time. When the time runs up, people then can vote to continue or not. Again, this is a structure in and of itself, and actually several structures combined, because you've got voting, you've got a kind of a Kanban board, you've got timing, etc., etc. The hot seat, and you may have heard of, so the person in the hot seat has a question or an issue that is relevant to them that can also be voted on. And if it is voted on, then obviously the topic is of relevance to everyone. So the person in the hot seat represents part of the consciousness of the group. And in solving the problem for that person, you're solving three problems. One is the problem that the person has. Two is the problem of the group, because the person is representing the group. So if you, for example, are a team or an organization, you're solving that problem. And then thirdly, you're solving problems for each person in the group, because each person has some relationship to the problem of the person in the hot seat as well. Big room planning, and you might know this from sort of scaled Agile framework, but obviously it predates that quite significantly, is this idea of hive mind. If you get everyone together, you can resolve dependencies in real time with each other and get the real-time feedback from each other and the input of everyone. And so in a very short space of time, you can achieve greatly significant results by having everyone in the hive together and having some loose enough structures, not too tight, not too controlled, but controlled enough with boundaries and constraints to ensure that you do reach outcomes. So, brings us on to lean change canvases, obviously also a structure of some sort. So you have a canvas which facilitates a conversation just by its nature. If it's well conducted, well facilitated, then everyone is contributing to that canvas, to the conversation, coming up with a result, visualizing that result, and that is creates a structure in and of itself. Different types of canvases, all available in lean change, all with some kind of a particular angle or slant towards reaching some kind of results related to facilitating change. So that brings us on to boundary spanning. So again, if you've got quite rigid structures, you'll have, and even if you don't have rigid structures, you will still have these boundaries in pretty much every organization. You'll have horizontal boundaries across the organization, vertical boundaries in terms of rank and seniority, stakeholder boundaries with your stakeholders, different demographics within and around the organization, and then more often than not, different geographies to deal with at the same time. So let's look at how to make toast. This is from a TED Talk. It's just a gentle introduction to how you could potentially negotiate boundaries. So I'm using it here a little bit more like a metaphor. So the idea here is that each person gets to design how to make toast. And you may have seen it, but I've just taken a particular short snippet from it because I want to show how important it is to get everyone's individual bias first or solution first, and then from that to then move towards finding a combined solution. So let's see what happens first. So if we play this, you see at first they're all designing their own toast, and then they go away and they come, they end up with each having their own individual solution. They then go away and reflect on that, and then the instruction is, okay, now you can mess with anyone else's as long as you make it fit with the whole. So don't be precious about yours or anyone else's solution. Mix and match as much as you want. Just make it fit with the whole. So then they come back, and you can see it gets very messy, and everyone's moving around stuff. and then they go back again. Whoop. Let's try that again. So then they come back again. And as you can see here at the end of the second round, there's still a lot of items there, but there's some kind of a flow to it, and some of them are mixed with each other. But then they go back, they reflect, and then they come back for a last round where the instruction is now make it fit one long line from left to right, only one item in each column from left to right, so one straight line. So then they come back again. And then you have the solution. So how does this relate to boundary spanning? So the first thing to do when you are connecting groups to come up with innovative and new outcomes is not to jump too fast to just throw them in and connect them with each other. If any of you have been through change programs, you may have come to, or mergers or acquisitions or some kind of a major restructuring, you may have started from the entry point of, well, let's get everyone into a room and or some big party and connect people, make them like each other. And when they like each other, then they'll work better together. What that is often missing is just jumping to the third stage without considering the first two. So really what we have to do first is say, who are we separately? What do we represent? What do we bring to the table that we believe is good? And then have that reflected from the others back to us. So some methods can be used with things like appreciative inquiry to say, okay, well, what do I acknowledge that's good in what you bring to the table? What do you acknowledge that's good in what I bring to the table? We reflect that to each other, and then only do we then connect. That's a bit more like the sociable part. And then finally, we mobilize, which is just to do something together. So achieve something significant together without necessarily any particular structure, just to start that off. And then from that, we can start to see some innovative ways that we might be able to then weave the best of our team with your team, or our teams with your teams, or our organization with your organization. And then we can start to use more creative techniques to actually transform and create something totally innovative and totally new. And that may or may not emerge depending on how evolved the organization becomes. So I was working with a bank that when I walked in, we had like two different roles, and one role was positioned on the one side of the table, one role was positioned on the other side of the table. There were two groups, and it was walking in and it was like sort of coming into peace negotiations, where it was kind of one side and the other side. And I compare that to a situation of a merger between two companies that I was in, where actually at the outset, it seemed like it was much more friendly and people were connecting with each other. But as things came through, the former example actually had a much better result, because at least they were true to what was really happening, is that there were very clear differences between the one group and the other group. And so they started from the buffering stage, which is the correct place to start. The second group started from the connecting stage. So it seemed like they were connected, but when it got down to the real nitty-gritty of things, they weren't at all. And so that then had to surface as issues. We then had to go back to the buffering stage and go and start again, go through crisis talks, all kinds of things to get people to actually acknowledge that things weren't working between them, what those problems were, bring those problems to the table, have them reflected, and then go back to connecting with each other again. So, of course, this is not a linear process like most things. There is some linearity to it, but it's probably better represented by a spiral. So here are the buffering, reflecting, connecting, mobilizing, weaving, and transforming on the right-hand side. And we could say that those are loosely categorized into three categories of firstly managing the boundaries, then forging some common ground, and then only finally discovering some new frontiers. So this is an image from the Scaled Agile framework, and then everyone goes boo, hiss, hiss, boo, boo. No, hold on a second. Before you do that, let's just acknowledge that if we have these organizational boundaries, geographic boundaries, each of them a hierarchy in and of themselves, at least we can acknowledge that one potential first step could be to say, well, where does value flow across these boundaries? And this is where the Scaled Agile framework came up with this concept of a kidney. I'm very quick to say that it's not always a kidney, but yeah, in the example, it looks like it's in a kidney shape. But that could be, so it really depends on where you are as to which structural intervention might be the first step towards more cross-functionality, more boundary spanning across geographic boundaries, at least ring-fencing value, so that value can be produced end-to-end within some kind of a virtual structure. And then the discussion wouldn't be complete if we didn't then talk about enterprise agile frameworks, which is always an interesting and fiery discussion. But the point I wanted to bring across here is that frameworks firstly are a combination of patterns, or we could say simpler structures, that then aim to concatenate each other with the ultimate aim is to align, synchronize, and coordinate people towards objectives. But in order to use or adapt the frameworks to any particular context requires understanding the underlying patterns and their relationships. So I sometimes think of it a bit like a recipe. If you're a good cook, you would first understand the properties of each individual ingredient, and then how those ingredients combine with each other and mix with each other into, say, mixtures or pastes or kind of groups of spices or herbs which go together and which don't go together. And then out of that could come recipes. But if you're not a good cook and you jump straight to the recipe without understanding those ingredients and the nature of those ingredients, you might get it okay sometimes, but it's never going to be as good. And probably sometimes you'll make quite a bad mess of it, even if you try and follow the recipe. Something hasn't been perfectly explained in the recipe, and you don't have the experience, you don't have the intuition to know that I need to change this or change that. So it really is both art and science, and it really does require understanding the patterns in the first place. But the ultimate aim has to be to align, synchronize, and coordinate. And if it's not doing that, then it's often going in the opposite direction. It's used as a structure to control, as a rigid structure, rather than a looser structure with boundaries and constraints. Like in any good complex adaptive system, you need to have good boundaries and constraints, but then the flexibility to maneuver within those boundaries and constraints and adapt to the particular context. So this is the organizational structure of Morningstar. It looks a little bit different to the hierarchical structure that we looked at the beginning. So if you don't know who Morningstar is, they kind of mentioned a lot in the sorts of management world and change world. So if you've eaten Heinz ketchup or Campbell's tomato soup, you've probably used the products many times without even knowing it. They're the largest processor of tomato-based products, certainly in the States and I think in the world. And so they don't have like a formal structure. They don't have any formal managers or bosses. And so their communication web is talk to whoever and work with whoever you need to work with. They do have some basic structures in place, but there's no kind of chain of where you need to go through in order to get to any particular person. So if we had to look at this structure in kind of time lapse, we would see it's constantly evolving, constantly moving, constantly maneuvering. So it's a constantly evolving structure. So this is called a murmuration. So you may have seen these birds, starlings, and how they move, almost as if they're one organism. And this is maybe the idea of which we're trying to kind of move towards with our structures, is that everyone in some way is in unison and is adapting to the needs of the moment, so that it actually appears as if you are one organism moving, as opposed to multiple different organisms moving. And it's quite amazing what actually comes out of this, where it's almost difficult to explain just scientifically. And many have actually posited that what is actually happening when these organisms move together, for example, schools of fish and flocks of birds, is that there is actually, they are actually moving like an organism. So the whole is actually bigger than the sum of its parts. And that there might actually be some fields between the individuals that have not been scientifically measured yet, because there's some scientists who say, if you put your finger into water where there's a school of fish, the whole school of fish, you may have seen, just kind of moves almost as if it's one organism at the same time, and say that the reflex reaction, that would be too quick for them to move that reflex reaction in relation to each other and make those calculations quickly enough for that to happen. And so therefore there actually is almost like a unified brain or a unified heart for that school of fish. And if you've ever worked in a really good team or in a really good organization, you can often sense that and feel that actually this team, you can sometimes tell immediately when entering a team or when walking into a room of a team or an organization, that there is something there in the field that makes it unique and like an organism that works all together. So let's have a look at what it looks like in this flock of birds. So one thing you'd also probably noticed with those is the thought often comes up, who's leading here? Like who is the leader? And we could say that, well, there is no leader, or that there's someone leading for or a bird or a group of birds, or smaller group or larger group that is leading at some point, and then others take over, and then others take over. So that's some kind of agility in the leadership. So who is leading is probably whoever is most best placed to lead at that particular moment, but then that could change to others. Or we could say, in that case, maybe the group is leading itself, or everybody is leading in unison. So they're listening in to each other and to what's needed from that field of birds. So I just wanted to bring up another kind of approach around leadership agility, which is to acknowledge here, according to the 8 dimensions of leadership, that there is no hierarchy there as well. As you can see, it's a circle, and there's also no preference as to where on the circle to be. You could say that through some kind of profiling or testing, that everyone would land up more in one part of the circle than in another part of the circle. But that if we're talking about true agility, then it's the agility of each person or each leader to be able to respond to the needs of the moment, and so to be able to move around the circle in response to the leader, to the needs of the moment. That would be true leadership agility, depending on the situation and the role that you need. So perhaps if there is a best place, it would be the flexible place. And especially, I know coming a lot from the Agile world, there is certainly a bias to saying, well, what would make a good Agile leader? The answer I almost always get is in the bottom half of the diagram, or maybe the bottom right, or maybe the right-hand side, but very rarely in the sort of top or top left side would people say, well, that makes a good Agile leader. And the argument there is, well, if you are truly agile and adaptive, then you're agile and adaptive to the needs of the moment. So sometimes you need to be quite direct and commanding in the decision making or direction in which to go, because that is what's needed in that particular moment. So just one thing to look out for. If you're interested in this, we're not going to go into detail here, then we have a session again in I think about 2 weeks time. It'll be in the Lean Change, where we'll actually do a basic profiling of ourselves, and then do some kind of cool exercises and discussions about different scenarios and how we can move across and what that means for us in our roles and as leaders. So, and there's also a profile that you could do on your own before that session, which would be even more helpful, which is included in the description. Cool. So you got some homework to do, is to make a small change in temperature, whatever that might be. So what is your small change in temperature going to be tomorrow when you go back to work, or today, depending on where you are in the world. And that's all I have for you. Open to questions, or I thought maybe we could even do a fishbowl conversation around this topic if people are up for it.